Welcome to episode 2 of Girmit Focus, and this is Satish Rai. In the last segment, I talked about how Fiji's indenture system, Girmit, is not an isolated incident, but is a part of nearly 250 years of labor transportation, enslavement of human beings by Europeans, starting off in the Americas, and when the African slavery was abolished and the former slaves refused to, by and large, work for the colonial planters, the Europeans looked at the Indians in India. By the time India was taken over largely by Europeans, mainly by the British, and since 1834 to 1879, when the transportation of Indians began to Fiji, they had honed in the skill of recruiting Indians and transporting them to the colonies, and then exiling them there permanently, mostly because according to their contract, most of them were supposed to return to India free of charge. And in Fiji's case, 25,000 of the Girmitiyas went back to India after 10 years of indenture, and in many cases much before then. In some cases even after arriving, after 1 or 2 years, they brought back their indenture and paid their own way back to India. But today I'm going to talk about the factors which existed in Fiji, which made it possible for Fiji's first Governor General, Sir Arthur Gordon, to transport Indians to Fiji. And once again, we have to go back and look at the history, and history of modern Fiji starts around 1800, when the first white people, the Europeans, began arriving in Fiji. And in the beginning, most of them were beachcombers and escapees from Australia, the prisoners who were transported to Australia under the penal system to work in Australia. They escaped on ships heading towards Fiji, and they jumped ships and they landed in Fiji. And of course, quite a few of them had guns with them, and as is normal since 1492, the Europeans conquered land with guns in one hand and Bible in the other. And of course, in Fiji's case as well, the people with the Bible, the missionaries, soon followed. First of all, they made the base in Levuka, the business people and the people with the guns. They started to take sides with many warring chiefs, and they started to help them. And they also brought a lot of alcohol with them, and somewhere in the history book has been written, in order to find Levuka, you just had to follow the gin bottles floating in the sea around Fiji. That may not be entirely true, but it shows that those people were also heavy drinkers, and some of the drinks were imparted to the chiefs for favors, and the history records in Fiji there's a lot of favors were given to these the new arrivals, the Europeans, the whites, for helping them in the warfare and providing them with drinks and tobaccos and other stuff bought from New Zealand and Australia, which the locals were not familiar with. And in return, the chief gave them what they wanted, and soon these Europeans, the Australians and New Zealanders had acquired a lot of land in Fiji, buying almost nothing, just tobacco, gin, and lending their guns to the chiefs. And 1850s there was another scramble to acquire land in Fiji because there was a cotton boom in Americas because of some incidents in America where cotton production had depleted, and this short-lived boom, desire to acquire cotton brought about a lot of people from Australia to acquire land under very dubious means, and today there are many local and international historians who have written, they have dissected the history and have written very good informative books about how those land were acquired. And most of the Vitilevu, if you look at the recent books, I'll provide a list as I go along of the books which people can read, and you'll see most of the Vitilevus best lands were acquired by the Europeans. And once again the problem was that of labor. They did try to force the local indigenous population to work on these farms, and they were not able to because the local indigenous community were not used to work under those conditions in the capitalist mode of production, because they were used to the communal way of living. So they gave that up, and then the infamous blackbirding started, where a substantial number of people from the Melanesian countries were captured and brought to Fiji, first to work on the cotton plantation, and then they decided they're going to plant sugar cane. But these people too did not provide good labor. They could not, because their way of life was also a communal way of life, and they were not used to this hard labor system imposed upon them. And the cruel blackbirding system had to stop under very, very tortuous circumstances. And then they also looked at China and brought some Chinese, and once again that was not successful, mainly because maybe they brought laborers from China, from those areas where sugar cane was not planted. And as this was happening, mainly the plantations were owned, large plantations were owned by a number of Australian and some New Zealanders, and it was they're competing against each other, and but they were also encountering resistance from the local natives, and the famous Tuka movement comes to my mind, And so they conspired with the local chiefs, especially with Dakambau, and they were managed to persuade Britain to take over Fiji, mainly to provide safety to these European planters. And thus Fiji was taken over by Britain in 1874. And Britain appointed Sir Arthur Gordon, very correct choice as far as the British was concerned, to become the first Governor General of Fiji, and but with some strict conditions. He was given only 100,000 pounds to start the colony off, and thereafter he was supposed to run Fiji with the income generated in Fiji itself. So he had a very hard task. Yeah, so to use within that budget of 100,000 to make Fiji economically viable. And he was a very experienced person. He had worked in Mauritius and in Trinidad and Tobago before, and so he knew exactly what to do to make Fiji financially self-sufficient. Firstly, he was aware that the local natives would not be able to provide the labor, because he wanted to turn Fiji into sugar growing, producing industry. So he confined the indigenous population to the corals, and then made them work on a communal setting, and of course they were not spared. They had to provide taxes, and there's another matter for another session. And also, so the Fijians were confined to working in the communal setting. And the second thing it did, there were a lot of competing planters, European planters in Fiji. So he invited the CSR, the Colonial Sugar Refining Company, to come to Fiji, and in a very short period they acquired a vast number of plantations and owned the majority of the land. And the situation was again where the Europeans control a vast amount of land which can be cultivated, but they had no one to work on them. And here Sir Arthur Gordon once again looked at the time-tested labor transportation, which he had seen in Mauritius and Trinidad to work very well, and that was the labor from India. So he worked with, consulted the British Raj in India and the British government in Whitehall, and they decided to capture and transport Indians to Fiji. And I like to say that there was no consultation with the Indians in India at all in this transportation system, which started in 1879 and which ended in last shipment in 1916. So that is a brief history how and why the Indians were brought to Fiji, and in the next episode I will discuss how the recruitment of Indians took place in India. Until then, goodbye.